Commander Jake Torres was having what he generously called a Tuesday when the universe decided to get weird on him. He'd been sitting in his cramped office aboard the UES Defiance, contemplating whether the coffee maker's latest attempt at beverage creation qualified as a war crime, when the hologram flickered to life. And what a hologram it was. The alien standing before him looked like someone had taken a peacock, given it delusions of grandeur, and then stretched it to 7 feet tall. Its iridescent feathers shimmered with every pompous gesture, and its voice carried the kind of refined accent that suggested it had never worked a day in its life. "Greetings, primitive human," the creature began, and Jake immediately knew this was going to be one of those conversations. "I am Lord Vextar, Grand Ambassador of the Galactic Council of Superior Beings." Jake took a sip of his coffee and immediately regretted it. "Superior beings, huh? Let me guess, you guys hold elections and everything." The alien's head tilted in confusion, those ridiculous feathers rustling. "Elections? We do not comprehend this concept. We are naturally superior by virtue of our advanced evolution and superior intellect." "Right, naturally." Jake leaned back in his chair, which squeaked in protest. "So what can I do for you, Lord Fancy Feathers?" "Lord Vextar," the alien corrected with wounded dignity. "And I come bearing a tremendous honor for your species. The Galactic Council has decided, in its infinite wisdom, to extend an invitation to humanity to participate in the first ever Galactic Combat Championships." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Combat Championships? That sounds suspiciously like organized violence." "It is the most prestigious tournament in the galaxy," Vextar continued, his chest puffing out with pride. "Warriors from the finest species compete for glory, honor, and the right to represent galactic civilization. And we have gracelessly decided to allow humans to participate." The way he said "allow" made it sound like they were doing humanity a favor by letting them get beaten up in public. Jake had been around long enough to recognize a setup when he heard one. "Let me get this straight," Jake said, setting down his cup. "You want us to send someone to fight alien warriors in what I'm assuming is a tournament where everyone expects humans to lose spectacularly?" "Your species shows promise," Vextar replied, which was diplomatic speak for "you'll probably die horribly, but it'll be entertaining." "The Council believes this will be an excellent opportunity for humans to demonstrate their potential to the galaxy." "Uh-huh. And what exactly happens to the species whose champion loses?" Vextar's feathers ruffled slightly. "That is merely a minor detail. The important thing is the honor of participation." Jake had been in enough briefings to know when someone was dodging the question, but honestly, the day had been boring enough that intergalactic gladiator matches were starting to sound appealing. "All right, Lord Vextar, I'll bite. When and where?" The alien's expression brightened considerably. "Excellent. The tournament begins in 3 cycles at the Grand Arena of Worlds. You will be humanity's champion, Commander Torres." "Wait, hold up. When did I agree to be the champion? Did you not just accept the invitation?" Jake stared at the hologram. "I said I'd bite, not that I'd get my teeth knocked out for the entertainment of pompous space peacocks." But even as he protested, Jake found himself genuinely curious. How bad could it be, really? Famous last words, he thought to himself. "The transport will arrive tomorrow," Vextar announced. "Do try not to embarrass your species too badly, Commander. The galaxy will be watching." The hologram flickered out, leaving Jake alone with his terrible coffee and the growing suspicion that he'd just volunteered for something incredibly stupid. He took another sip of coffee and winced. Yeah, definitely stupid. But possibly less painful than this coffee. The Grand Arena of Worlds turned out to be exactly as over-the-top as its name suggested. Jake stepped off the transport ship and found himself gaping at a structure that looked like someone had decided the Colosseum wasn't quite gaudy enough and had added neon lights, floating platforms, and what appeared to be holographic fireworks that spelled out death or glory in 17 different languages. "Welcome, meat sacks and energy beings, to the most spectacular display of violence in the known galaxy." The voice boomed from speakers embedded in every surface, delivered by what Jake could only assume was the arena's announcer. She appeared on massive screens around the complex, a purple-skinned alien with 4 arms and an enthusiasm that suggested she'd been mainlining caffeine for the past century. "I'm your host, Boom Voice Betty, and boy do we have a show for you today. Our champions have arrived, and let me tell you folks, we've got some real specimens this time." Jake looked around at his fellow specimens and immediately understood why Lord Vextar had been so confident about humanity's chances, or rather, lack thereof. To his left stood a creature that looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a bodybuilder and then given it anger management issues. Its chitinous exoskeleton gleamed under the arena lights, and when it noticed Jake looking, it clicked its mandibles in what was probably not a friendly greeting. "That's Crix the Bone Breaker," Betty's voice helpfully provided. "Representing the glorious Crex warrior caste, 8 feet of pure killing machine, folks. His favorite hobbies include dismembering opponents and collecting their skulls." "Charming," Jake muttered. Next to the bug monster stood something that looked vaguely humanoid, if you squinted and ignored the fact that its entire body seemed to be made of swirling energy contained in a translucent shell. Its eyes, if they were eyes, pulsed with an unsettling purple light. And here we have Mind Render Zelton of the mystical Mandari. Watch out for this one, sports fans. They say he can liquefy your brain with a thought. Literally. We've got the cleanup crew on standby. The energy being turned its attention to Jake, and he felt a slight pressure in his head, like someone trying to pick a lock inside his skull. Jake concentrated on the most obnoxious song he could remember, an earworm jingle from a toothpaste commercial, and played it on mental repeat. The pressure immediately vanished, and the Mindari actually stepped backward. "Problem, Sparkles?" Jake asked pleasantly. The third champion looked like someone had taken a perfectly normal humanoid and then replaced random body parts with high-tech machinery. Its left arm was entirely cybernetic, crackling with energy, and half its face was covered by a targeting array that whirred and clicked as it scanned Jake. "Unit designation Mech 9 of the Superior Metallics Collective," it announced in a voice that sounded like a computer trying to be intimidating. "Scanning human combat potential. Assessment, negligible threat level." "Well, that's not very nice," Jake said. "I haven't even introduced myself yet. Commander Jake Torres, representing the humans who apparently don't know when to say no to obviously terrible ideas." Betty's voice boomed again. "And there you have it, folks. Our human champion. Isn't he adorable? Look at that fragile bone structure, those pathetic little muscles, that complete lack of natural weaponry. The bookmakers have him at 5,000 to 1 odds of surviving the first round." 5,000 to 1? Jake called up at the screens. "Come on, Betty. That's just insulting. I'm at least worth 4,000 to 1. Around the arena, he could hear what he assumed was alien laughter, though it sounded more like a collection of dying machinery and angry geese. The other champions were looking at him like he was an appetizer they were saving for later. "Now then, champions," Betty continued, her forearms gesturing dramatically, "let me explain the rules. It's simple. Fight until someone can't fight anymore. No holds barred, no mercy, and absolutely no crying to mommy when things get messy. The winner of each match advances to the next round, until we have our ultimate champion." Jake raised his hand. "Quick question, what happens to the species whose champion loses?" "Oh, that's the fun part." Betty's grin revealed far too many teeth. "The losing species gets to serve the winning species as honored servants for the next century. Isn't that exciting?" The other champions suddenly looked a lot more interested in Jake, but not in a friendly way. More in a let's make sure the humans get to experience a century of servitude way. "Right," Jake said, mostly to himself. "No pressure at all." Crix clicked his mandibles again, and this time Jake was pretty sure it translated to something along the lines of, "You're going to look great as my footstool." This was definitely going to be interesting. The first round matchups were announced with all the fanfare of a cosmic circus. Jake found himself facing Crix the Bone Breaker, which honestly seemed about as fair as matching a goldfish against a blender. The arena floor transformed into what Betty cheerfully described as a delightful obstacle course of pain, complete with spikes, pit traps, and rotating blades that hummed ominously. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted life forms," Betty announced. "Place your bets now. Will the human last 30 seconds, 20, or will he set a new record for fastest dismemberment?" Jake stepped into the arena, and the crowd's roar was deafening. Thousands of aliens from dozens of species had packed the stands, and from their excited chittering, clicking, and howling, they were clearly expecting a massacre. In the VIP section, he could see Lord Vextar lounging on what appeared to be a floating cushion, already counting his winnings. Creeks entered from the opposite side, and up close, he was even more terrifying. His exoskeleton was scarred from countless battles, and his clawed hands flexed with eager anticipation. When he spoke, his voice was like gravel in a cement mixer. "Human," Crix rumbled, "I will make your death quick if you beg properly." Jake looked up at the 8-foot monster and shrugged. "You know, Crix, that's really thoughtful of you. Most people don't even offer. But I've gotta ask, do you always talk this much before a fight, or are you just nervous? The arena went dead silent. Apparently nobody had ever questioned Criff's pre-battle routine before. Nervous? Crick's mandibles clicked in confusion. Yeah, butterflies in the stomach, stage fright, performance anxiety. Jake began walking casually around the arena, hands behind his back like he was taking a leisurely stroll. I mean, you've got this whole reputation thing going on. Bone breaker, skull collector, professional scary bug. Must be a lot of pressure to live up to the hype. Crick's head swiveled to follow Jake's movement, clearly not expecting a psychology lesson. I do not feel nervous. Sure you do. Look at you all tensed up, clicking those mandibles. Classic stress response. Tell me, when was the last time you fought someone who wasn't already terrified of you? The crowd was murmuring now, confused by this bizarre turn of events. This wasn't how gladiatorial combat was supposed to go. There should have been more screaming and less therapy by now. What? Crix was now completely off balance, literally turning in circles trying to keep up with Jake's pacing. It's okay, big guy. We all have insecurities. Yours is probably that deep down, you're worried you're not actually as scary as everyone thinks. That maybe if you fought someone who wasn't intimidated by your whole act, you might not be as good as your press releases claim. I am the greatest warrior of the Crux. Says who? Your mom? Your agent? Have you ever actually fought anyone who wasn't already convinced they were going to lose? Jake stopped walking and faced Crix directly. Because right now you look less like a bone breaker and more like a very confused insect having an existential crisis. That did it. Crix let out a roar that shook the arena walls and charged, all strategy forgotten in his rage, which was exactly what Jake had been hoping for. The thing about 8-foot-tall killing machines is that they're used to their size and reputation doing most of the work. They charge straight ahead because that's always worked before. They don't expect their opponent to simply step aside at the last second and let momentum carry them face first into one of those conveniently placed rotating blades. Crix hit the blade mechanism with a sound like a car crash in a scrapyard. The impact sent him sprawling, his exoskeleton cracked, and his dignity in tatters. He tried to get up, took one look at Jake's expectant expression, and promptly passed out. The arena was so quiet you could hear a pin drop, or in this case, hear boom voice Betty's jaw hit the announcer booth floor. Well, Jake said, addressing the stunned crowd. That was anticlimactic. Anyone know if there's a gift shop? I'd like to buy Crix a self-help book. Betty's voice finally returned, though it was notably less boisterous than before. Ladies and gentlemen, by technical knockout and what appears to be psychological warfare, the winner is the human. She said it like she was asking a question, as if maybe the universe had made some kind of clerical error. In the VIP section, Lord Vexstar had gone from lounging confidently to sitting bolt upright, his feathers practically standing on end. Around him, other alien dignitaries were frantically checking their betting slips and looking like they'd just watched their retirement funds evaporate. Jake waved to the crowd, who responded with confused silence rather than cheers. Thanks, everyone. I'll be here all tournament. Try the nachos. I hear they're made from real cheese. As he walked off the arena floor, he could hear the whispered conversation starting up in the stands. Words like impossible and fluke and what just happened were being repeated in various alien languages. But Jake noticed something else. In the competitors section, the remaining champions were no longer looking at him like he was an appetizer. They were looking at him like he might actually be dangerous. Which was probably the first smart thing any of them had done all day. The second round arena was what Betty enthusiastically called the maze of certain doom, which Jake thought was a bit redundant. How certain could the doom be if they bothered making it a maze? But he kept that observation to himself as he faced his next opponent. A Metalix warrior designated Tech 7, who looked like someone had rebuilt a linebacker using spare parts from a starship. Unit Jake Torres, Tech 7 announced in that same robotic monotone they all seemed to share. Your victory over the Crex was analyzed. Conclusion: statistical anomaly, probability of repeat success, 0.003%. You know, Jake said, casually leaning against one of the maze walls, for advanced artificial intelligences, you guys sure are bad at reading the room. The maze suddenly reconfigured itself, walls sliding and rotating to create new passages. Jake watched with mild interest as Tech 7 immediately began calculating optimal paths, his targeting array spinning furiously. Calculating maze solution, Tech 7 announced. Estimated completion time 4 minutes 37 seconds. That's adorable, Jake said, and then did something that apparently no previous champion had ever thought of. He started climbing the wall. The thing about mazes is that they're only challenging if you agree to follow the rules. The walls weren't actually that high, maybe 12 feet, and Jake had done enough obstacle courses in his military training to make the climb look easy. Within 30 seconds, he was sitting on top of the maze, looking down at Tech 7, who was still mechanically working his way through the passages below. "Hey Tech," Jake called down. "Up here." The cyborg looked up, and Jake could practically see his processors overheating as he tried to reconcile this development with his programming. "That is not regulation," Tech 7 stated. "Show me where in the rules it says I can't climb," Jake replied, pulling out what appeared to be a small device from his pocket. "Also, while you're looking that up, catch this." He tossed the device down, and Tech 7 caught it automatically. It was Jake's emergency beacon, which was currently transmitting a very specific frequency. "What is the purpose of this device?" Tech 7 asked, just as every piece of cybernetic equipment in his body began malfunctioning simultaneously. "Oh, that? Emergency transponder. Turns out when you broadcast on the same frequency that Metallic's tech uses for internal communication, it causes what we humans like to call cascading system failures." Jake grinned down at the increasingly twitchy cyborg. "I learned that from your species' technical manual, which Lord Vextar was kind enough to provide in our welcome package." Tech 7 was now spinning in circles, his targeting array making sounds like a broken garbage disposal. "This is irregular combat methodology." "Yeah, we humans are big on irregular," Jake said, hopping down from the wall and landing next to his malfunctioning opponent. "We call it thinking outside the box. You should try it sometime." Tech 7 collapsed in a shower of sparks, and Jake retrieved his beacon. The crowd's reaction was notably different this time. Instead of confused silence, there was actual nervous muttering. In several alien languages, Jake was pretty sure he heard variations of, "How did he know that?" and, "That's not supposed to be possible." But the real entertainment was in the competitor section. Mind-Render Zalthon was no longer radiating his usual psychic arrogance, and the remaining Krex warriors were actively backing away from Jake as he passed by. More interesting still, they were starting to cluster together, whispering among themselves. By the third round, things had gotten really interesting. Jake's opponent this time was supposed to be a Vorthan pain beast, which looked exactly as pleasant as it sounded. 8 feet tall, covered in spikes, and apparently capable of inducing paralysis through some kind of fear toxin it secreted. But as Jake entered the arena, he noticed something unprecedented. There, huddled near the competitor entrance, was a small group consisting of 2 Krex warriors, a Mindari energy being, and what appeared to be a very nervous lizard person from a species he didn't recognize. One of the Krex, missing several limbs from what Jake assumed was an earlier match, clicked hesitantly. "Human Jake?" "That's me. What can I do for you?" "We have been observing your combat techniques," the Krex continued, its voice much less confident than Krix's had been. "We wish to, how do you say, compare notes?" Jake blinked. "Are you asking me for tactical advice?" The group exchanged glances. The Mindari spoke up, its voice like wind chimes in a hurricane. "Your methods are unconventional. We had not considered the possibility of psychological manipulation, combined with environmental exploitation, or rule interpretation that prioritizes victory over traditional combat aesthetics," added the lizard person in a surprisingly high voice. "Guys," Jake said slowly, "are you trying to form an alliance with the human you were planning to turn into a servant?" More uncomfortable glances. The second Krex warrior, who was apparently the designated spokesman for this little group, clicked nervously. "We have reconsidered our initial assessment of human combat potential. We think we may have made an error." Jake looked at this collection of supposedly superior alien warriors, all of whom were now looking at him with what could only be described as hopeful desperation. "Let me get this straight. You want me to teach you how to fight like a human?" "If you would be so kind," the Mindari said. "In exchange, we offer you our full support in future rounds." This was too good. Jake glanced up at the VIP section, where Lord Vextar and his fellow council members were having what appeared to be a heated argument. Several of them were frantically waving what looked like betting slips, and their feathers were so ruffled they looked like they'd been through a blender. "All right," Jake said, grinning. "Lesson 1. Stop trying to look scary and start thinking about what your opponent expects you to do. Then do literally anything else." The pain beast chose that moment to lumber into the arena, roaring and secreting fear toxin like it was going out of style. It was clearly expecting Jake to cower in terror like every previous opponent. Instead, Jake looked at his new alien student body and said, "Watch this." He walked straight up to the pain beast, pulled out a small spray bottle from his belt, and gave it a few squirts. The creature immediately stopped roaring and started sneezing uncontrollably. "Lesson 2, Jake called back to his audience. Always carry decongestants. Turns out fear toxins don't work so well when your opponent's sinuses are completely clear." The pain beast, now unable to see through its streaming eyes and uncontrollable sneezing, stumbled into one of the arena's energy barriers and knocked itself unconscious. And lesson 3, Jake concluded, sometimes the best way to win a fight is to not actually fight at all. Behind him, he could hear his impromptu students frantically taking notes. In the VIP section, Lord Vexstar had gone from looking worried to looking like he was about to molt from stress. Around him, other council members were pulling out communication devices, presumably to place very different bets than they had originally planned. But the best part was watching Boom Voice Betty struggle to commentate on what was happening. Her usual enthusiasm was now tinged with confusion and what sounded suspiciously like admiration. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted beings," she announced. "I've been calling matches for 3 centuries, and I have never seen anything like what's happening here. The human appears to have turned the Galactic Combat Championships into some kind of tactical seminar?" Jake waved to the crowd and headed back toward his new group of alien apprentices. "All right, everyone, gather around. Next lesson, how to use your environment as a weapon. And remember, if you're not cheating, you're not trying hard enough." The remaining champions, including the supposedly invincible defending champion, were now watching these impromptu strategy sessions with expressions that ranged from fear to outright panic. This tournament was definitely not going according to anyone's plan. Except maybe Jake's. By the time the finals arrived, the Grand Arena of Worlds had transformed into something that would have made any sports psychologist weep with joy. What had started as a brutal gladiatorial tournament had somehow evolved into the galaxy's first interspecies cooperation workshop, with Jake as the unwitting instructor. The competitors section now looked like a support group. Krex warriors were sharing snacks with Mindari energy beings. Vortham pain beasts were getting meditation lessons from reformed metallics units, and everyone was taking turns practicing what Jake had dubbed creative problem solving in the training areas. "Remember," Jake was saying to a group that included former opponents and several species that hadn't even been in the original tournament, "the key is to think about what your opponent expects, and then do the exact opposite. Blix, show them that move we worked on." The lizard person from earlier, whose name turned out to be Blixstar the Spine Ripper, though he'd asked everyone to just call him Blix, demonstrated a technique that involved using his natural camouflage abilities not to ambush opponents, but to confuse them into attacking empty air while he safely disarmed traps from a distance. "Excellent," Jake applauded. "See? You don't have to rip spines to be effective. Sometimes the best victory is the one where nobody gets hurt." "This is so much better than spine ripping," Blix said happily. "My therapist is going to be so proud." The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed. In the VIP section, what had started as a small argument between Lord Vexstar and his fellow council members had escalated into what could only be described as a full-scale diplomatic incident. Alien dignitaries were shouting in languages Jake didn't recognize. Feathers were flying, and at least 3 different species appeared to be threatening each other with what looked like lawyers. "The human was supposed to lose," Lord Vexstar was shrieking, his voice carrying clearly across the arena thanks to some unfortunate acoustics. "The whole point was to demonstrate human inferiority and secure their servitude. How was I supposed to know they'd turn everyone else into collaborators?" "Maybe," suggested a particularly large alien that looked like a cross between a rhinoceros and a filing cabinet, "you should have actually researched human combat techniques before assuming they were inferior. Maybe they don't have claws, or natural armor, or psychic powers. How was I supposed to predict they'd weaponized friendship?" Jake was trying not to laugh when Boom Voice Betty's voice boomed across the arena, though even she sounded somewhat bemused by recent developments. "Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of various classifications, we have reached the final round of what has been without question the most unusual tournament in galactic history. In one corner we have our unexpected finalist, Commander Jake Torres, of the human species, who has somehow managed to turn a death sport into a team-building exercise." Polite applause echoed from the stands, which was a far cry from the bloodthirsty roaring that had greeted Jake's first appearance. And in the other corner we have our defending champion, the undefeated, unstoppable, and until recently superior, Betty paused dramatically, Prime Unit Omega Zero of the Metallics Dominion. The arena floor split open, and Jake's final opponent rose from below on a mechanical platform. If Tech 7 had looked like a rebuilt linebacker, Omega Zero looked like someone had decided to rebuild a tank using parts from a nightmare. 12 feet tall, covered in armor that seemed to absorb light, and equipped with enough weaponry to level a small city. "Oh," said Blix quietly. "That's not good." "Unit Jake Torres," Omega Zero announced, its voice carrying the authority of 1,000 battles. "Your unconventional tactics have been analyzed and cataloged. Countermeasures have been developed. Your probability of victory has been calculated at 0%. Jake looked up at the mechanical monster and felt a familiar flutter of nervous excitement. "You know, Omega, every time one of you guys tells me my chances are 0%, I end up winning anyway. Have you considered that maybe your math is off?" "Metallic's calculations are perfect. We do not make errors." "Right, sure. Quick question, though. When was the last time you fought someone who had the entire arena rooting for them?" Omega Zero's head swiveled to scan the stands, and for the first time its confident posture seemed to falter slightly. Because Jake was right. The crowd, which had started the tournament baying for human blood, was now clearly on his side. Alien species that had never spoken to each other were sitting together, sharing snacks, and wearing what appeared to be hastily made Team Human banners. "This is..." Omega Zero paused, processors working. "Unprecedented." "Yeah, we humans are big on unprecedented," Jake said. "But here's the thing, big guy. You're not just fighting me anymore." As if on cue, every single one of Jake's former opponents and current students stood up in the competitors section. Krek's warriors clicked their mandibles in solidarity. Mindari energy beings pulsed with supportive colors. The pain beast from round 3 actually managed what might have been a thumbs up, despite not having thumbs. "We stand with human Jake," announced his original Krek student, whose name Jake had learned was actually Klex the Thoughtful, though he'd kept the Bonebreaker title for professional reasons. "He has shown us that true strength comes not from violence, but from understanding. Team taught us that winning doesn't require destroying your opponent," added the Mindari, whose energy was now a warm gold instead of the threatening purple it had been initially. "He helped me overcome my spine-ripping addiction," Blix called out, getting emotional. "Do you know how hard it is to find a good therapist when your species is known for spine-ripping?" Omega Zero's targeting systems were now spinning frantically, trying to lock onto targets that weren't actually threatening him. "This does not compute. You are all competitors. You should desire each other's destruction." "That's where you're wrong, Chrome Dome," Jake said, stepping closer. "See, you guys invited humans to this tournament because you thought we were weak. But you made one fundamental error in your calculations." "What?" "Error." Jake grinned, and around the arena dozens of alien species grinned back, as much as their various anatomies allowed. "You assume that because we don't have natural weapons we weren't dangerous, but our greatest weapon isn't claws or fangs or psychic powers?" Omega Zed's voice actually carried a note of uncertainty. "What is your weapon?" "We make friends with people, and then we teach them to make friends with each other. And before you know it, your nice orderly tournament where everyone hates everyone else has turned into a big family reunion where everybody's on the same side." The mechanical champion looked around the arena, finally seeming to understand what had happened. The tournament hadn't just been disrupted, it had been completely transformed. Where there should have been bitter rivals, hoping to see each other destroyed, there was now a community of beings who had learned that they had more in common than they'd ever imagined. "But," Omega Zero said, his voice now definitely uncertain, "the rules state that there can only be one champion." "Well," Jake said, "that's where things get interesting, isn't it?" Betty's voice crackled over the speakers, and for the first time since Jake had arrived, she actually sounded nervous. Folks, we seem to have encountered a situation that's not covered in the official tournament regulations. Stand by while we figure this out." In the VIP section, Lord Vextar had gone completely silent, staring at the scene below with the expression of someone watching their entire worldview collapse in real time. "You know what I think, Omega," Jake said conversationally. "I think you're about to learn the most important lesson of all." "What lesson is that?" "Sometimes the only way to win is to realize that the game you're playing isn't worth winning." And with that, Jake did something that had never been done in the history of the Galactic Combat Championships. He sat down in the middle of the arena floor and started applauding his opponent. The applause was slow and deliberate, each clap echoing through the suddenly silent arena. Omega Zero stood frozen, his targeting systems whirring helplessly as they tried to process this unprecedented situation. His entire combat matrix had been designed around the concept of opponents who wanted to fight him, not opponents who wanted to give him a standing ovation. "What are you doing?" Omega Zero finally managed. "I'm celebrating you," Jake said, still clapping. "You're the defending champion, right? You've won this tournament how many times?" 17 consecutive victories, Omega Zero replied automatically, though his voice carried the confusion of a computer asked to calculate the square root of purple. 17 times! That's incredible. You must be an amazing fighter. Jake's applause grew more enthusiastic. "Tell me, what made you want to become a champion in the first place?" This question clearly hadn't been in Omega Zero's programming. His mechanical form actually swayed slightly as his processors worked overtime. To prove the superiority of the Metallic's dominion, to demonstrate our combat efficiency." "But did you ever actually want to fight?" Jake asked. "I mean, before all the programming and the upgrade packages and the combat protocols. Did little Omega Zero wake up thinking, gee, I hope I get to hurt someone today?" The question hit Omega Zero like a logic bomb. Jake could actually hear cooling fans spinning up as the champion's systems tried to handle this unprecedented query. Around the arena, the crowd had gone completely silent, hanging on every word. Omega Zero's voice flickered. "I was constructed for combat. I do not have preferences outside my programming." "See, that's where I think you're wrong," Jake said, getting to his feet but keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. "Because if you were just programmed for combat efficiency, you would have attacked me the moment I sat down. But you didn't. You talked to me instead. That suggests that somewhere in that shiny metal head of yours, there's something that actually wants to understand rather than just destroy." Omega Zero's weapon systems, which had been charging ominously since his entrance, suddenly powered down. This is not how combat works." "That's because this isn't combat anymore," Jake said gently. "This is just two beings having a conversation. And you know what? I think you're tired of fighting." The mechanical champion looked around the arena, taking in the sight of former enemies sitting together, sharing food and stories. His optical sensors lingered on a group where a Krex warrior was teaching origami to a Mindari energy being, while a reformed pain beast provided commentary. "Happy," Omega Zero observed. "Yeah, they do. Turns out most people would rather be happy than be superior. Who knew?" Boom voice Betty's voice crackled uncertainly over the speakers. "Folks, I'm not sure what's happening here, but it appears our final match has turned into some kind of philosophical discussion." From the crowd came a voice Jake recognized as belonging to one of the Vorthan dignitaries. "Let them talk. This is the most interesting thing that's happened in centuries." "But the tournament rules," Betty started. "Screw the tournament rules," shouted another alien. "When's the last time you saw a Metallics unit question its own programming? This is history." Lord Vexstar, meanwhile, had apparently reached the final stages of a complete nervous breakdown. "This isn't how any of this was supposed to work," he wailed. "Humans were supposed to be weak. They were supposed to lose. They were supposed to become our servants, not turn everyone into pacifists." "Pacifists?" Jake called up to the VIP section. "Who said anything about pacifists? We're not pacifists, Lord Fancy Feathers. We're just practical. Fighting is a lot of work, and frankly, making friends is way more fun." Omega Zero was now looking directly at Jake with what could almost be described as curiosity. "You could have attempted to exploit my momentary confusion. Instead, you continued the conversation. Why?" "Because," Jake said, "winning a fight against someone who doesn't really want to fight isn't actually winning anything. It's just bullying with extra steps." The mechanical champion was quiet for a long moment, his systems running through calculations that had nothing to do with combat efficiency. Finally, he spoke. "I have been champion for 17 tournaments. I have defeated thousands of opponents, and I have never once asked myself if I was happy." "And, are you?" Another long pause. "No, I do not believe I am happy. I believe I am lonely." The crowd let out a collective "oh" that probably violated several galactic noise ordinances. Jake grinned. "Well, that's easy to fix. Want to join our support group? We meet after the tournament for snacks and tactical analysis. Klex makes these amazing protein bars that taste like victory but without all the actual violence." "I would." Omega Zero paused, his voice suddenly much softer. "I would like that very much." And then something happened that had never occurred in the history of the Galactic Combat Championships. The defending champion powered down his weapons, extended one massive mechanical hand, and shook hands with his opponent. The crowd went absolutely wild. Not the bloodthirsty roaring of earlier tournaments, but genuine celebration. Aliens were hugging, crying, and in at least one case spontaneously composing victory ballads. Betty's voice returned, now tinged with something that sounded suspiciously like tears. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted beings, I'm not sure how to score this, but I think we can officially declare this tournament a tie. Actually, Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through his impromptu microphone technique of cupping his hands, I think we can declare it something better than a tie. What's that? Betty asked. A success. Everyone who wanted to learn something new learned something new. Everyone who wanted to make friends made friends, and everyone who wanted to find a better way to solve problems than hitting each other until someone falls down, well, mission accomplished. Lord Vextar made one last desperate attempt to salvage his original plan. But the servitude clause, the losing species must serve the winners. Jake looked up at the panicked alien dignitary and smiled his most innocent smile. Oh, that's still in effect. The VIP section went dead silent. See, the thing is, Jake continued, humanity did lose. We lost the old way of thinking that said we had to be enemies just because we're different. We lost the idea that being superior means making other people feel inferior. We lost the notion that winning requires someone else to lose. He gestured around the arena at the mixed groups of former enemies, now planning joint vacation trips and comparing family photos. So, according to the rules, humanity has to serve the galaxy for the next century. And you know what? We're happy to do it. We'll serve as teachers, as mediators, as friends. We'll serve by showing everyone that cooperation beats competition, every single time. The silence in the VIP section was broken by what sounded like Lord Vextar's head hitting his desk. Repeatedly. But here's the really beautiful part, Jake added, his grin now approaching dangerous levels of smugness. Since everyone else learned from humans, and humans lost, that technically makes everyone else human adjacent, which means the entire galaxy is now qualified to serve alongside us. Omega Zero's optical sensors brightened. That is remarkably clever. Thanks, we humans are big on technically correct. It's the best kind of correct. Betty's laughter boomed across the arena. Well, folks, it looks like the Galactic Combat Championships are officially over. And I think I speak for everyone when I say this has been the most unexpectedly heartwarming blood sport in galactic history. As the crowd began filing out, chattering excitedly about the day's events and making plans for species exchange programs, Jake found himself surrounded by his former opponents turned friends. So, Kleck said, clicking his mandibles thoughtfully, what do we do now? Jake looked around at the diverse group of beings who had started the day as mortal enemies and were now planning a potluck dinner. Now we go teach the rest of the galaxy that the best way to prove you're superior is to help everyone else become superior too? And if they don't want to learn? Asked Blix, though he was smiling as he said it. Jake's grin became positively diabolical. Then we'll just have to be aggressively nice to them until they change their minds. Omega Zero's optical sensors flickered in what might have been electronic laughter. I am beginning to understand why your species is considered dangerous. Oh, we're not dangerous, Jake said, wrapping his arms around the shoulders of a Krex warrior and a Mindari energy being simultaneously. We're absolutely terrifying. We make people want to be better than they are. As they walked out of the arena together, Jake couldn't help but chuckle at the irony. The aliens had invited humans to a deathmatch to prove human inferiority. Instead, they'd accidentally discovered that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy wasn't claws or weapons or psychic powers. It was hope. And humans, it turned out, were absolutely lousy with the stuff. Poor bastards never stood a chance.